Welcome to Closer to Venus. This is Johnny Burke. Today's guest, author of Your Journey Was Never Meant to End, is Dr. Bruce Kaloski. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Johnny. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
A title like Your Journey Was Never Meant to End, that could probably spawn a million different questions. Tell us about your practice and then how you got involved in the study of reincarnation and past lives and near-death experiences as well.
Technically, I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. I have been one professionally since 1978, so it's 42 years going on 43. Then I've done past life regression for just about that long. Actually, I've done it for longer than that. I was doing it before I even knew how to do it. I'll explain that in a little bit. For me to tell you how I became interested in past life regression, you need to know how I became interested in hypnotherapy. And it goes back to my father. He was a fighter pilot during the war, stationed with the 8th Air Force in England. He was injured during the war. His plane went down the English Channel. And after the war, the family bought a piece of property. I'm from Long Island, New York. And they bought a piece of property in which they put an airport. My uncle, his brother, became a mechanic at the airport. My father, naturally, as a pilot, became the instructor. I was rummaging through the attic one day as a kid. I found a whole bunch of books on hypnosis. Then I would see him doing it. I asked him, what is this? What do you do hypnosis for? He used to use hypnosis with his students to help them get through the FAA flight exam and also the written exam. So I used to watch him doing that. But I also found a book which I didn't know then, was a seminal book, one of the first published about past lives and reincarnation, a book called The Search for Bridie Murphy. And that was written back in the 50s by an amateur hypnotist named Bernstein. I think his name was Maury Bernstein. And it talked about a woman who he hypnotized who had purported memories of a life that she lived supposedly back in the 1880s in Ireland. And that's what brought past life regression and reincarnation to the mainstream. So I became interested in that, and I didn't know what it was. I asked my father what it was. He explained the concept, the theory of reincarnation, and he believed that he was a reincarnation. He was a fighter pilot during the Second World War. He believed that he was a fighter pilot during the First World War who was shot down and killed over France. I guess maybe prematurely. He thinks he came back not too long after being killed and was born here in the United States and then became a fighter pilot then. So that spurred my interest in reincarnation and past life regression. I did a lot of reading on that. And one day, I would say it's the late 60s, probably around 68, 69. After doing the reading, I was sitting having a cup of coffee with my cousin, who lived a few doors down from me on Long Island. And I asked, we talked about reincarnation. I said, hey, you want to give it a shot? Want to try it? She said, sure, I'm game. So I guess God cares for fools. I didn't know what I was doing. I could have left it stuck there, but I did it with her, and then I've done it ever since. Then I started doing it professionally. So that's my story of how I got into reincarnation and past life.
Interesting. The way I understand it, the past life regression or PLR therapy has its roots in regression therapy, which has been around for a while, correct? Mm. It's basically used when someone's got an issue and they don't really know what the origin is. So you put someone on hypnosis to figure out that it was caused by something that when this person was like 5 years old.
This is true. But where this comes about is that a general suggestion to a person, because you want to find causative factors if you're doing analytical type hypnotherapy, or Freudian, if I may use that word, Freudian hypnotherapy, as opposed to behavior modification. You'd ask a person to go back to a time when this problem first came about. So you're going back to causative factors. I think what stirred the original case that was reported in The Search for Bridie Murphy is he was hypnotized enough for some, I don't know what the reason for it, ask him to go back to when the problem started, and she jumped back to Ireland in the 1880s. He didn't intentionally bring her back there. So it was, in essence, a spontaneous regression, which is also how Brian Weiss got involved in this field. Back in, I think it was probably the 80s, early 80s.
It was the 80s.
Yeah. He was a psychiatrist in New York. I think the same thing happened to him. He asked a woman to go back to the time when this problem first started, and she went back to a past life.
That's in Many Lives, Many Masters, I believe.
Yeah.
And he's in Miami now.
Is he retired, partially retired?
I think he is. I was actually tempted to go and see him but he's not taking patients anymore. But I do know a therapist up here that thinks that he can get me an interview with him. I thought, okay, I better get some practice first. That was an incredible book. And when I started reading about that, obviously I learned about Dr. Michael Newton and Journey Souls and so on. So when you have these sessions, have you ever had an experience where the memories of one of your clients predates recorded history? I think you have one that goes back to 6000 BC, the book.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
I have. Back to caveman times. You don't have that very often. I think if we believe that the seat of these memories is the subconscious mind, I think the subconscious probably naturally orders things chronologically. Although theoretically we've lived thousands, if not millions of lives, or thousands of lives over hundreds of thousands of years, there's no reason why our soul couldn't have incarnated in 50,000 BC. You could go back there, but it doesn't happen very often. The people who claim that the past lives in Atlantis were supposed to have existed, 20,000 years ago?
And you must be reading my mind. I really got interested in this years ago. I read a book by Edgar Cayce on reincarnation, and he speaks a lot about incarnations and past lives in Egypt and Atlantis, and even periods that were even before that. That could be, like you say, 20, 30, 50,000 years ago.
Yeah. Well, Egypt is common. Ancient Egypt, it's common to have people regress to ancient Egypt because I guess it does fall into the realm of recorded history. There are writings that go back 3,000, 4,000 years ago. It's just before that, like going back to Atlantis, Lemuria. Now you're going back to unrecorded history.
Right.
How do you prove that? How do you prove that even that Atlantis existed? There are different theories about that. Some say it's a fable. That it was a Plato who first wrote about the.
He did.
Oh, he was using the Greek island of, I think it was Crete, wasn't it?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think it was Crete, that one of the islands that supposedly sank. There was an island off of Greece. And others say, no, there actually was one. Some people say it was in the Bahamas. I don't know.
There's been reports of different locations, which you're not really sure, but there's an awful lot of past lives that go back to Atlantis and even before that. I first learned about that through the Edgar Cayce stuff. When you have these sessions, have there been experiences of, obviously there's past lives, but any experience of lives between lives?
Oh, yeah. That's really fun to do. Now, sometimes a person will jump to that. Although if you're doing a past life regression for a purpose, you're structuring it. So you're not giving a person total free reign. So after you take them through the death experience, typically you will review that life. Why were they there? What were they meant to learn, if anything? What are they going to take away from that life? And we bring them back to conscious awareness. In between lives was popularized, as you know, by Michael Newton. And it was done before that, too. There were several people who did that before. Michael Newton popularized it. I do them routinely between live regressions. There's different reasons why people want to undergo a past life regression. Well, the first one, and I explain this in my book, is what I call, this is for simple information. Years ago, there was a detective drama on TV that was a seminal. It was called Dragnet.
Yeah,
And,
I remember that.
You remember Dragnet? Right.
Yeah.
The actor Jack Webb played Joe Friday. And there was a famous catchphrase that he used. He would tell the people, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And I call that my Joe Friday session. I'll take people back because just to find the facts. Who was I? When was I? Where was I? What did I do? Simple, mundane facts. And then you bring them to the death period. It's a lot of fun. But above and beyond that, we can do what's called a karmic connection session. I always ask them, what do you want to achieve with a past life regression? Why are you doing it? And what they explain usually fits into what we call a karmic connection session, which goes back to the path, to the life that is directly responsible for this particular life, what you're experiencing in this life. And we look at people, relationships, that might have come over with what they call the soul tribe or the soul group. My mother back then was Uncle Tony in this life, whatever. So things like that can happen. That's called a karmic connection session. And then another one is between lives regression, which is for a different reason. Usually it's for a person wants to know what their life purpose is and their soul purpose and what hand they had in determining when they were going to come back to Earth, how they were going to come back, what their family would have been, what they're going to look like, their physical attributes. That's determined between lives, just one of the things, and also the life review of the life directly prior to that. And then there's, of course, past life therapy.
How does past life therapy differ from past life regression?
It's past life regression, but done for therapeutic purposes. For instance, a fellow in my class, he was teaching in Santa Cruz, California. I was teaching a past life regression therapy training for people who want to do what I do. And I pick people out of the group, out of the class, the students, bring them up, and I demonstrate on them. Well, this I asked, so what do you want to work with? He says, I want to become a motivational speaker to the Hispanic market. But there's one problem. I have a fear of public speaking, which might work against you if you want to be a motivational speaker. We go back and find out why that happened and how we can get rid of that. Says, let's do it. So I took him back. He regressed to a time in ancient Rome. And his job in ancient Rome was as an announcer, believe it or not, an announcer at the Colosseum. Whenever they gathered at the Colosseum for the events, he would have to take a scroll, stand out in the middle of the Colosseum ground, open the scroll, and read to the assembled people the events of the day. Whether it be lions eating Christians or the gladiators dismembering each other, whatever it was. He'd have to read it out. Well, one day, a couple of his friends decided to get together and play a joke on him. And they gave him a blank scroll. So he got out there in the middle of the Colosseum. There's a whole assembled crowd. The Emperor of Rome is out there too. And he opens a scroll and there's nothing on it.
It's nothing.
Totally blank. And he froze. So that translated to a fear of public speaking, which is manifesting itself in this life. So we took him through it and he was able to overcome it.
And that is also in your book, is it not? That particular example?
In my book. Another one I give is many years ago, I had a fellow come in. He was sitting in the chair and he was squirming around like something was bothering him. I says, do you have a problem? Are you not comfortable? He says, I have a pain in my back. And I said, what is it from? And he said, they don't know. The doctors don't know where it came from. So I said, well, I probed him to see if he was amenable to past life regression. He said, I think I'd like to try it. Brought him back the next session. We did it. He went back to a time as a fur trapper in Colorado in the 1800s. And he was beginning to encroach on the land owned by an Indian tribe. They didn't like that. They didn't like the white man coming in and trapping on their land. So they had a powwow. They brought him into the camp and whatever they do, they smoked the peace pipe, whatever. And they came to an agreement. How he had to make certain concessions. They would make certain concessions. He got to continue his fur trapping on that. As he was walking back after the meeting to his horse, there was a younger renegade Indian who didn't like the elders doing business with the white man. He snuck up behind this guy and tomahawked him in the back. And he died a very horrible, painful death. Even the medicine men of the tribe couldn't even save him. And I prefaced that by saying he would explain to me that most of his life, he was always, in his words, looking behind him, bordered on paranoia. He always looking behind him, like someone was coming up behind him. And well, yeah, someone was in another life. And that translated both to his perceived paranoia and also the pain in the back. And after we did that, the pain was gone.
So that would be a good example of the karmic connection because he's trying to find out the reasons.
Fear of water could be caused by a drowning, fear of heights, falling off a cliff. So
I definitely have a fear of heights. I was on a tower up in Jupiter, and I remember just going up the stairs and I was almost getting a panic attack. I never really knew what the reason for that is, but that does make sense. I'd like to paraphrase, since we're talking about references to books. This is from Dr. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. Basically, what he said was, the study of life after death and past lives has addressed a spiritual impoverishment in our culture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. Well, Moody was before Newton, and he was the first to bring up the notion of an existence between lives. Absolutely. And Newton calls what he does spiritual regression.
Spiritual regression. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. I know that you're very familiar with the term spiritual psychology. A term for the genre, what would it be?
A term for the genre, the coin a term for the genre? Well, you could use spiritual regression, but you have to realize that there are people who believe in reincarnation, but they're not especially spiritual. They're looking at it from a clinical point of view. The people who say that they're spiritual, normally people who believe in a oneness, that we all spring from one well, from one source, we're all a part of one another. If you're asking me, can we coin a phrase for this that will encompass everything? I don't think we can.
Right. It's a little tricky.
So many genres, so many schools of thought within this. Have one all encompassing? For some people, probably for many people, maybe more than 50% spiritually fits. For instance, people who've done research in this, the solid researchers like Ian Stevenson, another person before him that I draw a lot of my stuff from is Dr. Helen Wambach. And she started doing this back in the 1960s. She was a psychologist who did some hard clinical research on this. And at the end of her research, she says, I don't think reincarnation exists. I know it exists. She had tables to back everything up. It's quite convincing what she did. And Ian Stevenson, the same thing. The difference is being that Helen Wambach worked in hypnosis. Ian Stevens and his successor, Bob Tucker, they're all spontaneous regressions. They're usually kids, usually 5, 6, 7 years old, and then they spontaneously regress and remember these lives. Then after that is gone. After about 7 years old, they seem to lose those memories.
I've heard that several times. Ian Stevenson did his research on children in that age group, but interestingly enough, they were not from the Americas or Europe. They were from other cultures where reincarnation is a lot more accepted, so therefore easier for them to access the memories.
That's right. But on the other hand, the man who took over his work, Jim Tucker, a lot of his stuff was done right here in America.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. And I cite many of his case studies in my book. The little boy who is from the Midwest somewhere, who remembers being one of the greatest golfers that ever lived, Bobby Jones. They say that this little kid was a reincarnation of Bobby Jones. Another one, there's evidence that he was the reincarnation of the man who wrote the screenplay, Sidney Howard, for Gone with the Wind, and received a posthumous Oscar for that. Then there's a little fellow who took a liking to baseball at about 3 or 4 years old. Turns out that he had a lot of memories of Lou Gehrig and the Yankees in the 1920s and 30s.
Right.
New things he shouldn't know at 3 and 4 years old.
I agree. Very much like in your book, if I may quote, under hypnosis, a San Francisco businessman tells about a life he led as an Egyptian trade merchant around 6000 BC, speaks Egyptian, writes in hieroglyphics. An Egyptologist checking the data accumulated in these sessions reports that the lifestyle described, language spoken, and the figures written are all representative of ancient Egypt, which is a good example of things that he probably shouldn't know or could not know.
Yeah, it stretches the bounds of credulity when you say, but they picked that up. They probably heard that. Also, Glenn Ford, the actor Glenn Ford. I think they went through 5 or 6 different regressions, and most notably, the one as a French cavalryman under Louis XIV, or one of the Louis, and he spoke French. But the interesting thing is, when they took his recordings to the language labs up at UCLA, not only did he speak French, which he said he had only cursory knowledge of in this life, but he was speaking a dialect, the 17th century dialect.
The specific Parisian dialect, I remember reading about that. That's a fairly well-known case because I read about that years ago.
There's so many of them out there that has hard, fast evidence.
I could not agree more. On the subject of religion, which is one rabbit hole I really don't want to go too far down, do you believe... Rabbit hole. I'm trying to be polite, but do you think that in these studies, near-death experiences, past life regressions, and so on, that the religion, the beliefs can kind of get in the way?
Well, they do influence it. You ask yourself, why is it that in a near-death experience, someone will come back to this life after dying for, quote unquote, 4, 5, 10 minutes, and they'll report having seen Jesus. But someone else will in India, they'll have seen their Indian gods, or if they're Buddhists, they'll have seen Buddha, if they see any deity. Most people don't even see a specific deity experiences. They may see a relative, and they someone who's not really identifiable, but they don't necessarily see a deity. In a clinical terms, we don't know what death is.
At least not yet, anyway.
But some of our conscious memory is still carry on in our belief systems for a time afterwards. That would mean a person would say, yeah, but he saw Jesus. That means that for sure Jesus existed. Oh, but wait a second. I didn't see Jesus. I saw Buddha. Who do you believe?
Right. That's where I think it kind of muddies the water a bit, because there's not a really clear answer within this type of research why some people see deities, the majority do not. I'm not sure whether Dr. Michael Newton's research indicated that might be part of their personality or their imagination.
Their culture, their enculturation, their belief systems.
Could be.
They might even say, I'm not a really hard and fast Christian. I go to church maybe every couple of Sundays a year, whatever, Easter and Christmas. So I had a near-death experience, and I saw Jesus. Because I'm not a really hard and fast Christian, this has to be true, because I saw him, and I really don't practice that much. Well, yeah, but you might have when you were a kid. Those memories are still there.
Right. That would make a lot of sense. One of the terms in your book mentions something about soul evolution. And one of the questions that I think a lot of us have is on the subject of reincarnation, where we incarnate over and over and over again until we reach a certain point where we don't necessarily need to come back in order to grow spiritually. Is that what you might be trying to explain with soul evolution, or is that something different?
No, that's exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Yeah, we reach a point. You learn more about this by reading about the teachings of Michael, which was a discarnate entity, just like Abraham is or Seth.
Mm-hmm.
Only there's a lady up in San Francisco. So they channeled Michael back in the 1970s, and it's called the Michael Teachings. They broke down the stages of soul evolution from infant to baby, young, mature, and old souls. It's like rungs on a ladder. The theory is that within each of these stages, there are substages. I think 7 different substages that take you through. Mm-hmm. So there's 35 different stages. Yeah, 35 different stages in all. But after that, then it goes to another place. It's not over after that. After you become an old soul. After that, you've got one of them is a transcendental stage where you can choose to return to earthly existence, but you do so with a specific purpose. And it's usually those people who might be people who start movements, like Jesus, Buddha, or
Gandhi.
Yeah. Some people think Pope John the 23rd was just such a
Mother Teresa.
Eckhart,
maybe.
Yeah, they come back for that, but they choose to come back.
Because they're teachers. Religious or not, I think a lot of us that really dive into this research because we want to know more, we can all pretty much agree that people like Jesus, is he our savior? He might be. I'm not really sure. I don't know if anybody is really sure, but he is definitely an ascended master at minimum. Right. I'm not trying to really insult the church or anybody for that matter, but at the same time, when I talk to people that go to church here in South Florida, I've noticed when I talk to some of the people that go there and they go to the Bible study classes, and we'll have these discussions like the kind of thing that we're talking about now. And often I'll get rebuffed with a response like, oh, Johnny, that's not in the Bible. Oh, Johnny, that's not in the Bible either. So one day we're sitting there at coffee. I asked, what does your Bible study teach you about Jesus being in India for 18 years? And all 3 of these girls just stood there with a blank stare. And I thought, what are they teaching these people? That's probably a discussion for another day. But every time I try to talk about this kind of material in front of anyone from that mindset, I kind of feel like I'm going backwards. I don't know if you have the same experience.
Absolutely. These are the very same people who say, I know what I know. I believe what I believe. Don't confuse me with the facts.
Don't confuse me with the facts. I like that.
It's amazing. And you could, if you wanted to take the time to do it, point out that there are phrases in the Bible that do speak of reincarnation. We'll go into that now, but
I think I know of one. Do you not recognize me as Elijah? That's probably one of the more well-known phrases, but I think it's almost common knowledge that any mention of reincarnation was purged from the Bible, 1800 years ago by one of the Roman emperors. But what's amazing to me is that this group of people I'm talking about are 30s and 40s. They know nothing about that. I like the idea of people going to worship, trying to learn more, deep in their spirituality, but they're being taught from, it's like a corrupted file on your computer almost. It's an incomplete textbook. And it's frustrating for anybody that wants to have a meaningful conversation, I think. It's probably another episode with one of the theologian types. I really like the idea of the soul evolution, which tends to explain things almost like in a linear fashion. You get out of it what you put into it. If you want to evolve, you can do that. But is it possible, and you've probably seen this in some of your cases, that when someone has the same issue in life after life after life, that seems to indicate that they're not doing the work that they need to be doing in order to ascend? Make sense?
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah, they're not getting it. And it's not an easy process. I mean, no one tells you, they may tell you in between lives, but no one tells you this life. I use an analogy in my book. If I'm sitting in school and I'm in the third or fourth grade and I'm taking a test and I take out a crib sheet, no cheating. You're not supposed to cheat. No one tells you that in this lifetime. They may, but it's not done on a soul level. So it's up for you to figure this out.
That might be the reason why we have hundreds, if not thousands, of incarnations. Some people figure it out sooner than others, I guess, but it's an absolutely fascinating area of study, something that I've been interested in for a really long time.
Also, people have a hard time when they say, well, I was never a bad person. I got news for you. Sorry to break this to you, but you are. Some people believe that the purpose of reincarnation is to allow the soul to experience life on all its different levels.
You might be a bad guy.
Yeah, a bad guy in one life, a good guy in the other life. I use this analogy. Years ago, back in the 1960s, Frank Sinatra had a hit song called That's Life. And one of the lines of that song says, I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn, and a king. I've been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. And I think that bespeaks, whether it's new or not, he was giving us a lesson on lifetimes that we can apply to all of it. We've all been these things at one time or another in our lives.
Jesus, in his many lifetimes, was probably a murderer at one point, over hundreds of thousands of lifetimes. I'd like to share this one segment of a show I saw on Gaia. It was Richard Martini, who's written lots of books, one of which is called, I believe, Hacking the Afterlife. And he's being interviewed and he's describing a scene where this person, I believe, was under hypnosis. He's in that life between lives. And he's meeting people that have passed, friends and family, a lot of them that he liked. And there's also people that he didn't like one of his uncles. And this uncle figure says to this man, don't you remember? We agreed on this. I'm sure you probably hear about that a lot in your sessions, right? It's incredible. It sounds almost too good to be true.
Last night, I did a session with a young lady who went back to Ireland, I guess in the early 1700s. And it turns out that she had a sister in that life who she had intense rivalry with. That sister is now her brother in this life. They have a little bit of rivalry, but they were able to resolve those issues, which they didn't resolve back in Ireland.
That reminds me of what you just talked about earlier, soul groups, where a lot of these people incarnate over and over again until they learn their lessons, right? Is that something that you see a lot? Or
yeah, you see that a lot. Now, again, there's one school of thought which says some people believe there are no lessons to be learned. It's all about experience, having experiences from different perspectives. Right? I was a pirate in one life, I was a priest in the other, and it's just to experience the different aspects of what it means to be human.
That's kind of hard to argue with. The experience obviously is very, very important. It's not like we can really say this is definitely the way it is. We can only theorize with the body of work that we have, which luckily for us is growing.
Yeah, and I think we have a hard time explaining this or understanding this. One of the best books I've read about 3 times. Let me see if I have it up here. Well, this is being recorded, but it's called The Afterlife of Billy Fingers.
I have that on audiobook. I just started it. That's supposed to be very good.
Oh, very good. I've gone through this about 3 times. I don't know exactly how they put it, but what it says is that humans have a hard time understanding why this is so, why these things happen. And that's part of it. Because if we knew why, it wouldn't be good, because without pre-knowledge, we wouldn't gather the best benefit from these lifetimes. We're not supposed to know.
That would make sense too, because if you know what's going to happen, you're not going to learn anything anyway.
No, that's true. It's very true.
Interesting. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us today.
My
It's been
pleasure.
an awesome experience. For our listeners, how can they find you online?
They can go to my website, which is drkaloski.com, drkaloski, or doctor, or the word drkaloski.com, or they can email me, and my email address is drkaloski, drkaloski @gmail.com.
Awesome. I will definitely put that in the show notes.
Also, if they're on Facebook, I have my Facebook group, which happens to be the same name as the book, my book. The book is on Amazon, by the way. Your Journey Was Never Meant to End, a compelling case for reincarnation.
Excellent. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. This is Johnny Burke. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.